This piece is called Viscera. Is anything written in verse poetry? Many people think this is true. I happen to disagree. Though it is true that poetry is indeed written in verse, does being written in verse really constitute a poem? I think not. Poetry is more than a bunch of words written on paper in a neat, tidy, gritty format. It has to have substance. It has to have much more than length and width. It has to have height. It has to have viscera. There's a fancy medical term. Viscera refers to the innards of the abdominal cavity. Without those innards, we wouldn't be able to function. Our metabolism would be shot, and our tissues would start to rot. A putrefaction from lack of nutrition. Same goes for poetry. Poetry needs viscera. Without it, poetry is flat, lifeless, dull, pointless. Poetry needs viscera. Poetry needs more than a nice sound. It needs a purpose. It needs to have a message. It needs to have an interaction with the audience. It needs to be interesting, maybe even entertaining. Plato gave an allegory about philosophy that strangely applies here. It seems that if one man finds the light of truth, a light outside the dark cave of reality, and if that man goes back to the public and tells them of that light, they'll all think he's an idiot or nuts. Or both. People rely on their perception. Their perception guides them. Anything contrary to their perception is either false or irrelevant, and that is to be expected. Why? What do people perceive when it comes to poetry? A bunch of romantic, flowery craft spewed onto a piece of paper in verses by a man who thinks he can impress women with illiteracy. An emo teen's blood-red wrist dripping angst onto each verse as he cries in his 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house because his bitch mom tells him to do his homework, because his bitch teacher tells him to read his assignments, because he can't deal with the pressures of, existing, claiming to be some nonconformist when really he's a whiny wuss. The musings of a lazy pothead who sits in a cafe strumming on a guitar, coming up with lyrics and verses for folk songs that never make sense because he never had the ambitions or the brain capacity to get a job. The junior philosopher, who instead of studying philosophy for real, decides to make it up himself and writes haikus about the philosophy, hoping to enlighten someone. Unfortunately, though not surprisingly, they suck. Haikus were never designed to be written in English. Now you know why haikus aren't taken seriously. That is, if they're not well written. My legal team advised me I had to add that disclaimer. Misinformation and malpractice. Verses and volumes of verses of pure, unfiltered, grade A crap. All of it very flat. Many teachers have said the following: great writers are also readers. So if you want to write poetry, do yourself a favor. Try reading some poetry before you put pen to paper. Get a sense for it. See the deeper meaning and see the art. But mostly, and I stress mostly, see the viscera. See the X factor that gives the poem life. See how the words are used. See how the poet interacts with the audience. See what the poem represents. What idea is the poet trying to get across? If I've said it once, I'll say it again. Poetry needs viscera. It needs that third dimension. It needs a reason for its existence. So if you're going to write it, or you're going to speak it, you better damn well mean it, or don't bother thinking about it. It's art. Be creative, but don't be careless.